Priya, a young woman caught in a dangerous web of emotion and obsession, was about to cross a line she could never return from. What started as an ordinary family relationship quickly changed into a deadly affair, one that would end in bloodshed and send shockwaves through the city. The air in Mumbai was thick with humidity that evening, the city's heartbeat pulsating through the dense traffic and crowded streets. It was a typical night for most people, but for Ramesh and Priya, it would be anything but typical. Their lives, which had already been tangled in complicated ways due to their shared family dynamics, were about to spiral down a path that would lead to one of the most chilling murders in the city's recent history. Ramesh, a 25-year-old man from a well-established family, had lived a comfortable life, his future seemingly secured with a job in a reputable IT company. His stepsister Priya was 3 years younger, a college student pursuing a degree in business administration. She had always been seen as the quiet, studious type by their extended family, her demeanor reserved, but beneath the calm exterior, she carried a weight of unresolved emotions. They had grown up in the same house after Ramesh's mother remarried Priya's father. Despite the marriage, the two families were never particularly close, their interactions often strained. Ramesh's mother, a kind-hearted woman with a soft spot for Priya, had tried to maintain a peaceful home, but the tension between Ramesh and Priya was undeniable. It wasn't until years later that the dark secret of their relationship would finally be revealed. By then, it was too late to change anything. The damage had been done. The summer of 2022 marked the turning point. Ramesh had recently broken up with his longtime girlfriend, and Priya, who had always admired her stepbrother from afar, was dealing with her own feelings of loneliness. In the confines of their shared house, their worlds began to collide in ways no one could have anticipated. What began as an innocent friendship, or so it seemed to the outside world, turned into something far more dangerous. Late-night conversations over shared cups of tea turned into something more intense. Ramesh and Priya would often find themselves alone, the house quiet and still as the rest of the family went to sleep. They would talk about their dreams, their frustrations, and the difficulties they faced in their respective lives. The bond they shared as step-siblings began to shift, slowly, imperceptibly, into something neither of them could truly comprehend. There was a shift in the way they looked at each other. At first, it was just a fleeting moment, a passing thought, but then it lingered. Priya began to dress differently, more provocatively, as if to catch Ramesh's attention. She would walk past him slowly, brushing up against him in a way that sent a chill down his spine. Ramesh, for his part, began to notice her in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't just her beauty, but something more unsettling, a magnetic pull that neither could resist. By June 2022, their once normal relationship had crossed boundaries. Ramesh started to spend more time with Priya, ignoring the subtle hints from his mother that something wasn't quite right. The guilt was buried deep inside, masked by the allure of the forbidden. He told himself it was just temporary, a phase they would get over. But Priya wasn't willing to let it go. Her feelings for her stepbrother had become obsessive, and she began to make it known in ways that made Ramesh uncomfortable. They began sneaking around their house, meeting in the dead of night, away from prying eyes. Their physical closeness grew, a slow burn that neither could resist. Their stolen kisses were filled with tension, an unspoken understanding that what they were doing was wrong, yet they continued. They believed, for a time, that they could control it, that they could walk away before it was too late. But as the days passed, the situation escalated. Ramesh was torn between his loyalty to his family and the feelings Priya had ignited within him. He knew this was wrong, that it was more than just an affair. It was an irreversible step into a dark and twisted place. Priya, on the other hand, saw no way out. She had fallen too deep, her emotions consumed by the love she felt for Ramesh. She began to believe that they were meant to be together, that no one could stand in their way. By the end of July, it was clear that things had gone too far. Priya started to talk about their future together, as if they could run away and start a new life. Ramesh, however, had started to have second thoughts. The guilt had become overwhelming, and he began to distance himself, hoping that time would make things right. He tried to keep his distance from Priya, but it only made her more desperate. On the night of August 3, 2022, things took a turn for the worse. Ramesh had decided to confront Priya, to end whatever it was that had been consuming them both. He couldn't live with the secret any longer. Priya, however, had other plans. She was not willing to let him go. Her obsession had grown to a dangerous level, and in her mind, the only way to keep Ramesh was to ensure he stayed with her. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Priya waited for Ramesh in his room. He entered, his heart racing with the weight of what he was about to do. Before he could speak, Priya lunged at him, her eyes wild with an intensity that shocked him. She held a knife in her hand, a glint of madness in her gaze. Ramesh froze, the air thick with tension. He tried to reason with her, but Priya, consumed by rage and love, refused to listen. The struggle that ensued was short but brutal. Priya's desperation fueled her strength as she drove the knife into Ramesh's chest. The blood soaked the sheets as he fell to the ground, his life slowly slipping away. Priya stood over him, her hands shaking, as she looked at the body of the man she had loved in ways no one should have. She was covered in his blood, her emotions a whirlwind of guilt, love, and rage. She had killed him. There was no going back, and as the reality of what she had done settled in, Priya knew that she could never escape the consequences of her actions. In the end, the tragic affair that had begun in the quiet corners of their home had spiraled into a senseless, brutal murder. The city of Mumbai, once unaware of the dark secrets hidden behind closed doors, was now left to grapple with the horrors of a crime that no one could have predicted. The murder of Ramesh was not just the end of a life, but the end of an innocence lost between a stepbrother and his stepsister. And as Priya was arrested, the world would come to learn the true cost of forbidden love. The quiet, uneventful nights that had once marked the rhythm of the family home were now a distant memory. The violent murder that occurred that fateful night would haunt the walls of the house forever. What had been an ordinary, almost predictable family dynamic had shattered in an instant, leaving only sorrow and disbelief in its wake. Priya stood in the aftermath, trying to piece together the world that had crumbled around her. In her heart, she believed she had no other option but to commit the unthinkable. Her mind, clouded by a dangerous obsession, had convinced her that this was the only way to make Ramesh stay forever. The moment Ramesh's body fell to the ground, his chest pierced by the knife, Priya's world shifted. A cold silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of her rapid, shallow breathing. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins moments before began to ebb, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. For the first time, she truly understood the gravity of what she had done. But there was no time to think, no time to wonder whether there was a way to undo the horror. There was only the pressing need to hide the evidence. Priya quickly wiped the knife clean, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain control. She moved swiftly, her mind racing with possible ways to cover her tracks. She removed the blood-stained sheets, folding them with a precision that betrayed the panic seeping into her thoughts. She needed to act quickly before anyone could find out what had happened, but she also had to be careful. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She moved Ramesh's body, dragging him into a corner of the room where it would be less likely to be found. His body, once full of life, now seemed like nothing more than a lifeless shell, an object to be hidden. Priya had always been good at hiding things, her emotions, her desires, her secrets. But this time, the secret was too dark to stay hidden for long. As the hours ticked by, she paced nervously, her thoughts moving in every direction. What would she tell her parents? How would she explain the disappearance of her stepbrother? She couldn't bear the thought of them finding out the truth. The shame, the guilt, the horror. It would destroy them. Priya had always known she was capable of hiding things from her family, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't just a lie. It was a crime. She couldn't let anyone know. That was the only thing she was sure of. If anyone found out, everything would unravel. The carefully constructed world she had built around her would come crashing down, and there would be no escaping the consequences. So, she kept quiet, her lips sealed as she tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But deep inside, she knew it wouldn't be long before the truth would come out. The morning light crept into the room, the sun setting as though it's ready to uncover a hidden truth. Priya had barely slept, her mind racing with every possible scenario, every possible way she could keep the truth from surfacing. When her parents woke up, they would expect everything to be as it had always been. They wouldn't suspect a thing. After all, she had done nothing wrong. In her mind, she had only done what she had to do. But as the day wore on, the weight of her actions grew heavier. Priya's attempts to maintain her composure were slipping. She found herself shaking uncontrollably, unable to focus on anything other than the cold, lifeless body of her stepbrother hidden in the corner. The horror of what she had done was impossible to escape. No matter how hard she tried, there was no running from it. It was as though the walls of the house had closed in on her, trapping her in a nightmare of her own making. By the time her mother and stepfather returned home later that evening, Priya's nerves were on edge. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy. She greeted them at the door, forcing a smile, hoping they wouldn't notice the emptiness in her eyes. They didn't. They never suspected a thing. But it wasn't long before the truth began to unravel. It wasn't just the physical evidence of the crime that would eventually expose Priya's actions. It was the changes in her behavior, the way she couldn't look her parents in the eye, the way she flinched whenever someone mentioned Ramesh's name. The cracks in her facade were becoming impossible to hide. The next few days were a blur. Priya found herself unable to focus on anything. Her thoughts were consumed by guilt and fear. She couldn't go on like this forever. She knew it. But there was no way out. There was no way to undo the murder she had committed. If you're enjoying this documentary, kindly subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories. As the days passed, Ramesh's absence became more noticeable. His friends started asking questions, calling the house to check on him. Priya lied, saying that he had gone away for a few days to clear his head, that he needed time alone. But the lies only piled up, each one weighing heavier on her conscience. Soon, the police came knocking. Priya's heart sank as the uniformed officers stood at her doorstep asking about Ramesh's whereabouts. The questions were simple, innocent enough, but to Priya they felt like a death sentence. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the pressure mounting with every passing second. There was no way to escape it now. The truth was coming, and it would be impossible to hide it forever. The investigation began with the usual routine: interviews, questions, a search of the house. It was during this search that the police discovered the blood-stained sheets in the laundry room. The officers immediately became suspicious, and it wasn't long before they started to piece together the events leading up to Ramesh's disappearance. Priya, despite her best efforts to remain calm, began to crack under the weight of the investigation. Her story started to fall apart, and the police grew increasingly suspicious. It wasn't long before Priya's carefully constructed appearance crumbled. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and eventually she was arrested. The shock and disbelief her parents felt were palpable, but there was nothing they could do. Priya's fate was sealed. The trial was swift. Priya's defense tried to argue that she had acted in self-defense, but the evidence told a different story. Ramesh had been unarmed, and the nature of the attack made it clear that it was anything but a defensive act. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was inevitable. Priya was convicted of murder, and the once bright future she had dreamed of was extinguished. She was sentenced to life in prison, her days behind bars a grim reminder of the choices she had made. The case became one of the most talked-about stories in the city, a chilling reminder of how obsession and unchecked emotions could lead to the destruction of lives. For Priya, the reality of her crime was something she would never escape. The images of Ramesh's lifeless body would haunt her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the twisted path she had walked. There was no redemption, no forgiveness for what she had done. And as the years passed, the story of the stepbrother and stepsister affair that ended in sick murder became a chilling legend, one that would echo through the streets of Mumbai for generations to come. Priya sat in her prison cell, a cold, sterile room that contrasted sharply with the life she once knew. It had only been a few months since her conviction, but already the once vibrant world she had inhabited seemed like a distant memory. The memories of her family, her home, and even Ramesh seemed like mere shadows. But one thing remained constant: her guilt. It was a companion that never left her, gnawing at her every waking moment. a reminder of the irreversible decision she had made. The days passed slowly. Each morning, Priya awoke to the harsh artificial light filtering through the barred window of her cell. She would lie there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, trying to grasp the reality of her situation. The sound of the prison's routines, the clanging of metal doors, the distant murmur of voices, and the cold silence that followed, was a stark reminder of the life she had lost. The prison was a world of its own. It was an environment where the rules were strict and the atmosphere heavy. There was no room for mistakes, no time for regrets. Priya learned quickly that survival was a matter of adjusting to this new reality. She had to blend in, keep her head down, and avoid attracting attention. At first, the other prisoners were curious about her. Her case had become one of the most talked about stories, and her presence in the prison brought with it an air of notoriety. She was the stepsister who had killed her stepbrother in a violent, senseless act. Some viewed her with disdain, others with a sense of cold indifference. Either way, she was left to navigate this new world alone. The days were long and lonely. Priya spent most of her time reflecting on what had happened. She could still remember that night as though it had just occurred, the moment when her obsession with Ramesh had reached its terrifying peak. The cold, detached expression on his face as he lay lifeless on the floor haunted her. She had been too far gone to see the warning signs, too consumed by her feelings to realize the danger she was heading towards. There was no denying the truth now, no excuse for the darkness that had taken over her mind. Priya found herself replaying the events in her head constantly, trying to understand what had driven her to commit such a heinous act. It wasn't as though she had planned the murder from the start. She hadn't woken up that day with the intention of killing Ramesh. The feelings that had built up over time, the jealousy, the desire, and the frustration had slowly turned into something much darker. Priya couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, but she knew that somewhere along the way, she had lost control. In the weeks that followed her incarceration, Priya's guilt turned into a kind of introspection, a process of self-examination that had no end. She began to ask herself difficult questions. Why had she done it? What had she hoped to gain? There had been so many moments when she could have turned away, so many times she could have chosen a different path. Yet, in the end, she had made the decision to end Ramesh's life. It was a choice that had left her with nothing but an empty void. Priya wasn't alone in her suffering. Her family, too, had been torn apart by the events that had unfolded. Her mother, who had once been her confidant, could barely look at her anymore. The shame and disappointment were written all over her face every time they met. Priya's stepfather had withdrawn completely, his anger and sorrow becoming an impenetrable wall between them. Even the smallest moments of contact were filled with tension, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Despite everything, Priya had tried to stay in touch with her parents, writing letters, sending apologies, and attempting to explain her actions. But the truth was that no words could ever truly convey the horror of what she had done. She knew that the damage was irreversible, and the relationships that had once meant so much to her would never be the same. The media coverage of her case had continued long after the trial had ended. News outlets had picked up the story, and Priya had become a figure of public fascination. Her story was told in shocking detail, analyzed by reporters, psychologists, and experts who all tried to make sense of what had happened. The press turned her into a symbol, a cautionary tale of obsession gone horribly wrong. They asked questions no one had answers to. What had driven this young woman to kill her stepbrother? What had happened in the family to make such a tragedy possible? But for Priya, all the answers she needed lay within herself. She knew what she had done, and she would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. No amount of media attention could change the fact that she had taken a life that had been intertwined with hers in ways she hadn't understood until it was too late. In the solitude of her prison cell, Priya often found herself thinking about Ramesh, the life he could have lived, the future he would never have. It was a thought that tormented her constantly. He had been so young, so full of potential, and now he was gone. She had robbed him of that future, and the weight of that loss crushed her every day. Over time, Priya began to withdraw even further. The friendships she had tried to form with other prisoners were shallow, and she found it difficult to connect with anyone. The other women in the prison were consumed by their own struggles, their own regrets, and Priya couldn't bring herself to reach out. She had no desire to make friends, no need for companionship. The only thing that mattered was the endless cycle of guilt and regret that continued to haunt her. Life in prison was harsh, but it also offered Priya the space to reflect. As the months passed, she began to see the consequences of her actions in a new light. She could no longer deny the devastation she had caused, not only to Ramesh, but to her family as well. The simple truths she had once ignored became painfully clear. The obsession that had consumed her was nothing more than a destructive force, one that had torn apart everything she held dear. A life, which had once been full of promise, had been shattered in the blink of an eye. Now all she had was the time she spent in prison, the solitude of her thoughts, and the knowledge that she would never be free from the weight of her crime. Priya's story was one of tragedy and loss, a story that seemed to have no redemption. She had taken a life in a fit of rage, driven by emotions she had failed to control, and now she was left to face the consequences. A life in prison, with no hope of ever escaping the memories of that night. She could never undo what she had done, and for Priya, the only certainty was that her crime would haunt her until the end of her days. Months had passed since Priya's conviction, and time inside the prison walls continued to stretch endlessly before her. The realization of what she had done, the depth of her crime, was always present, an unbearable truth that she could never escape. Yet, over time, the overwhelming numbness she had felt in the immediate aftermath of Ramesh's death began to dissipate. It was replaced by a steady, slow-burning remorse that gnawed at her from the inside. There was no hiding from the horror of what had happened, no way to avoid it. The authorities were firm in their decision. Priya's life had been reduced to that one irreversible mistake. Her trial had been a long, drawn-out affair, with experts trying to understand what had driven her to kill her stepbrother. Some said it was the toxicity of her feelings for him, the unrequited love that had festered over time. Others believed it was a mixture of jealousy and anger, emotions that had spiraled out of control. The truth, as Priya now knew, was far simpler. It was a catastrophic loss of self-control. She had let herself be consumed by her desires, and, in the process, she had destroyed everything that once mattered. But the world outside of the prison walls had not forgotten her. The media continued to sensationalize her case, drawing in countless viewers and readers, each eager for new details, for any sliver of understanding. People talked endlessly about Priya's motives, speculating on the why and the how of her actions. Yet, no matter how many articles were written or documentaries produced, they would never be able to capture the full extent of the pain Priya felt every day. The theories of psychologists and journalists could never fully explain the mess of emotions and confusion that had consumed her in those final, dark moments leading to Ramesh's death. Her lawyer, who had once been so hopeful, had visited her on a few occasions, offering the possibility of an appeal. There was a chance that the courts might show leniency given her age and the fact that she had been a victim of a dysfunctional family dynamic. But Priya wasn't interested in any of that. Her fate was sealed, and she knew it. The idea of freedom no longer seemed to matter. What was the point of being free if the weight of her actions would always follow her? It wasn't the prison walls that confined her. It was the burden of her guilt that held her captive, more so than any jail sentence could. Priya's family had tried to reach out to her in their own way. Her mother had sent her letters, though they were brief and distant. The pain in her mother's words was clear, but there was also a sense of finality. Her mother could not forgive her, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Priya's stepfather, however, had remained silent. It was as if he had disappeared from her life entirely, as if the tragedy had erased his presence. There was no more affection, no more family. Priya was alone, and the consequences of her actions had severed every connection she once held dear. Life in prison, meanwhile, had become a routine. Priya had long since abandoned any hope of returning to a normal life. She woke up every day to the sound of the prison bell, signaling the start of another monotonous day. The meals were simple, the company sparse, and the days bled into one another in a dull haze. There were no more distractions from the memories, no more distractions from the sense of overwhelming regret that filled every corner of her mind. She was left with nothing but time and the painful realization of what she had done. Priya's cellmates had become accustomed to her quiet, withdrawn nature. She didn't speak much, preferring to remain in the background. She didn't share the same small talk that many of the other women exchanged. She didn't tell stories, didn't gossip, didn't laugh. She simply existed within the confines of her cell. Some of the women tried to engage her, but she always pushed them away. What could they possibly offer her? They too had their own histories, their own regrets. But none of them had taken a life. None of them carried the kind of burden Priya did. There were moments when Priya wished she could escape from the prison of her own thoughts. She would lie in her bed at night, staring at the ceiling, hoping for sleep to come and offer her some relief. But it rarely did. Instead, the memories of that night came rushing back in vivid detail. She could still hear the silence that had followed Rames's death, the blood pooling on the floor, the shock on his face. She could still feel the rush of adrenaline that had flooded her body in the heat of the moment, the sense of power and control she had briefly experienced. It had all happened so quickly, but now, in hindsight, she could see how foolish she had been, how foolish it all seemed. What had she been trying to prove? There were no answers. No one could offer her a way out. No one could erase the horror of what had taken place. Priya's mind often wandered to the aftermath, how she had tried to justify her actions to herself, how she had convinced herself that Ramesh had deserved it. But there was no justification, no excuse. The truth was simple. She had killed him, and she had no way of undoing that. She would never be able to reverse the damage she had caused. The prison doctors, aware of Priya's mental state, suggested therapy sessions, and though she was reluctant at first, she eventually agreed. It wasn't a cure. Nothing could fix what was broken within her, but it provided a small semblance of structure in her otherwise chaotic life. The therapy was a slow, uncomfortable process. Priya spoke little at first, but as the sessions went on, she began to open up. She didn't speak of Ramesh often, but when she did, it was in fragments. Pieces of the night that she couldn't fully piece together. She couldn't explain her emotions, couldn't describe the twisted need that had led to his death. It was an experience she would never fully understand herself. And as the months turned into years, she grew increasingly certain of one thing: there would never be a day when she would not regret her actions. In prison, time became an endless cycle. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Priya's body aged, her face grew more tired, but her heart remained heavy with guilt. The past, in all its horror, was never far behind her, and as the years passed, it became clear that she would never find peace. The murder of her stepbrother, the act that had shattered her life and the lives of those around her, would follow her for as long as she lived. What drives a person to cross the line between affection and cold-blooded betrayal? Want to uncover more gripping true crime stories that will keep you up at night? Hit subscribe and never miss a twist.